afternoon, everyone. Hello, yeah. I'm delighted to introduce our session on South Africa's development and thinking behind a context-specific tag and track framework for a just transition. Yeah. As we all know, defining what counts as a just transition investment is a very difficult and contentious issue. So in May this year, the Impact Investing Institute of the United Kingdom published a document called Just Transition Criteria, which was designed to be a practical tool for fund managers to determine whether or not their investments could be categorized as just transition or not. This was a seminal piece of work which meaningfully moved the dial on how we begin to determine what is good enough for just transition investments. It was also felt that the unemployment, poverty, and inequality issues of the Global South and South Africa in particular were not sufficiently captured in this Impact Investing Institute contribution. As such, numerous parties in South Africa began developing a country-specific framework. TIPS is one of such research organizations, and today they will present their early findings on this work. So TIPS is using an iterative methodology where they have drafted a framework, tested it against real investments in South Africa, and then improved the first iteration framework according to what they found on the ground. Today, they will be taking us through the first iteration, the results of the first round of real-world application and testing, and the changes to be included in their second iteration. I am Lulamile Makaula, a project manager within the environment unit at the NBI, and I'll be your facilitator for today. I'm joined today by Gita Mora from the African Climate Foundation, and also the star of the show, Sandy Lowett from TIPS, who will take us through an update of progress on the tag and track work she is leading in South Africa. I'd also like to apologize for one of our financial stakeholders who was supposed to participate in this panel. Unfortunately, they weren't able to join us today due to a family emergency. So the agenda and session flow for today is we're going to get an overview of the tag and track project in South Africa from Sandy Lowett, and this will be followed up by an input from the African Climate Foundation presented by Gita on the role of philanthropies in South Africa, just transition, and the value of this research. And we'll finish up with a Q&A session. So the session is hosted by Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, better known as TIPS, which is a not-for-profit economic research institution that specializes in inclusive industrial growth. TIPS supports government policy and strategy development and do not consult to the private sector. They have been actively involved in just transition framing and research activities in South Africa and are currently working in the areas of just transition finance, green hydrogen, renewable energy, new energy vehicles, procedural justice, and the transition of the Mpumalanga economy in South Africa. So today it is my pleasure to introduce Sandy Lowett, the head of TIPS Just Transition Finance Research Effort. She is going to present their most current work, which looks at providing a practical tool for financial and non-financial corporates, government to test whether an investment counts as a just transition investment or not. The TIPS approach emphasizes that in this complex and young field, learning by doing and evidence-based research is crucial. So today, Sandy will be taking us through TIPS' journey of the first iteration of their framework, what they discovered when they tested the framework in the real world, and their progress towards an improved second iteration of the framework. So I'll hand over to you now, Sandy.
And good afternoon, colleagues in Dubai. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person to deliver this. Can you see my screen? Okay, great. As Lulamile was saying, TIPS has been doing quite a lot of research on the financing needs of just transition projects. And every time we were speaking to people in the financial services sector or people on the ground with projects, they kept on asking us, but what is going to count as a just transition project, and will we be eligible for superior financing terms and conditions, which is what we wanted to deliver for just transition projects. So we decided that we needed to spend some time trying to figure out what is going to count in a South African context. So we said that we needed to put together a framework. Sorry, I'm struggling. To put together a framework, and we wanted to develop a practical tool. And the tool needs to do some very heavy lifting in two areas. The first one is it needs to provide guidance and direction on what would constitute a just transition investment, specifically in a developing country context. And there are three questions that need to be answered in relation to that. The first is what's good enough to count as a just transition investment. The second is what needs to be measured to confirm that a project is delivering a just outcome and impact, and that's to protect against just transition washing and fronting. And the third question is how do we compare and contrast competing just transition investments? So, for example, if we have a limited pot of grant funding and there are multiple just transition projects trying to get their hands on that funding, how do we decide which project merits funding more than another? In the second category of heavy lifting that the framework needs to do, nobody's ever delivered a just transition. And so our thinking can take us only so far. We need to be able to use evidence and learn by doing. So we wanted to adopt a methodology that would support iterative production of frameworks and based on evidence and learning by doing in a very, very complex area. So what we've tried to do is to marry top-down theoretical research with bottom-up project level experience and information. We wanted to have concrete informational feedback loops so that future iterations got better over time, given the complexity of the topic. And then we very much believe that this is a long-term journey in terms of getting definitions and parameters and measurements right. And whenever we feel down about our progress, we always remind ourselves that it's taken 40 years to get a green finance taxonomy, and we're in year 2 of this project. So we hope it won't take 40 years, but we do believe it is going to be a long-term process. So the approach that we adopted was very much a learning by doing approach, and this is very simple. We came up with a first draft of what is a just transition transaction framework. We then collected information in August through to October, where we collected standardized information from projects. Then we applied those projects to the framework. And the thinking here was, if we end up excluding all the projects, then the bar was probably too high in the framework and there were problems with the framework and we would need to change it. On the other hand, if absolutely all the projects floated through and made it, then probably the bar was too low and there was something missing in the framework, and once again, we would need to change it. Based on that experience, we then developed a second iteration, and we are publishing that second iteration in March next year. So that's the learning approach. So in terms of how we set up the first iteration framework, we basically had a pre-screening requirement, and then we went on to evaluation. And initially our pre-screening were our non-negotiable criteria. And we said you need to meet all 4 of these non-negotiable criteria. If you exclude one of them, you will be excluded from further evaluation. So the first pre-screening criteria was we had excluded activities, which were new investments in fossil fuels, armaments, tobacco, and the sex industries. The second one is we said that a just transition project must include community and or a labor voice. And instead of just saying there needs to be engagement like they did with the III process in the UK, we went further and said there needs to be an engagement strategy. There also needs to be an implementation plan, and there needs to be a budget for that engagement implementation plan. Thirdly, we said you must comply with the South African Constitution and all our laws and regulations. And fourthly, we said there must be some internal organizational approval of the project, and there must be some funding applied to the project. And our thinking behind that is we didn't want people who just had ideas to be getting just transition status or designation. We wanted something that was actually realizable and executable. So once a project passed through those 4 pre-screening criteria, it then went on to evaluation. Now, our research on projects in the ground suggested strongly that in South Africa, we were finding projects that were driven by 2 specifically motivated drivers. They were either green projects, mainly motivated by providing a green outcome, or they were motivated by providing a socio-economic improvement outcome. And we found that those projects had very different characteristics. So what we've created is we've created a dual entry gate system where a project can say, I want to be evaluated as primarily a green project or primarily as a socio-economic project. So it's a lot simpler than it looks in the graph. If we begin on the top left, let's say a project champion decides they want their project to be evaluated as a green project. The framework says, does this project qualify as a green project? If the answer is no, it's excluded. If the answer is yes, we then ask a secondary evaluation set of questions. Does the project also seek to improve socio-economic outcomes? If the answer to that is no, we throw the project out. If the answer to that is yes, that means the project meets our green criteria, meets our socio-economic criteria, and from the pre-screening has community participation, then we declare it to be a just transition project, which is that green block in the middle. What we then discovered is that in South Africa, we have some projects that are going above and beyond in terms of their level of ambition as to what qualifies as just transition. And we found that some projects wanted to meaningfully enable previously disadvantaged communities. And we felt that that needed to be rewarded and incentivized. And so we created the block on the far right, which is called the Just Transition Plus project. And that is a project that meaningfully empowers a community or group of people. And I'll explain to you how we measure that later. And we're hoping that Just Transition Plus projects receive beneficial terms and beneficial access to finance. So that is the evaluation process. What we do in terms of does it count as green or does it count as socioeconomic improvement is for all of them, we put together a fixed table which says here are the qualifying objectives of a green project. Here are the qualifying objectives of a socioeconomic improvement project. Each of those objectives is broken down into a very specific list of qualifying activities, and each of those activities are matched with a given set of indicators, which at this point are standardized, but we do allow room for bespoke indicators as well. Now, what that codification gives us is it provides solid parameters and guidance to project champions to say, yes, my project counts, or no, my project doesn't count. And it gives those of us using the framework consistency and comparability across projects. So putting together the green objectives and activities was really easy because we used the green taxonomy. When we got to the socio-economic objectives and activities, there obviously was no agreed upon taxonomy. So what we did is we looked at various socio-economic needs assessments and research projects based on South Africa, and we came up with 4 high-level objectives. The first one was to support employment and livelihood opportunities, and then we broke that down into specific activities. The second was to improve access to services. The third was to support strengthening and developing existing and new supply chains. And the fourth was to improve community spaces, organizations, and services. So far, those seem to have been well received, but we obviously need to keep on developing and drilling down and making those better and crisper and better definitions and parameters as we move forward. In terms of the indicators, we used all the global north indicators so that we have as much interoperability as possible. So in terms of the data gathering exercise, we had an open call for projects, and then we invited 70 organizations who we know are particularly active in the space to fill in our information template. We got a 23% response rate, which is relatively high in South Africa, where we usually have a 10 to 12% response rate. And we found really, really interesting findings. The first thing is we were very pleased that there was a broad cross-section of project champions. We had a lot of interest from private sector, non-financial corporates, specifically the mining houses, the big chemical companies, and the food processing companies. The local and foreign DFIs were active in the space. The state-owned enterprises in South Africa had projects to contribute, and then there were quite a few private sector project developers who put in projects. In terms of geographic spread, we had 28% of projects which were non-place based. Now, this is very different from what we see globally, where all just transition projects are place-based. And this provided huge difficulties for the framework because we thought we'd have more place-based projects. And I'll explain to you how we dealt with that later. 28% of the projects were in Mpumalanga, and that is the key area in South Africa where our coal mining and coal power plants are based. So that's the equivalent of the Ruhr in North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany, for example. And we generally had a good national spread of projects. In terms of the sectors that the Just Transition projects were focused on, a relatively narrow focus of sectors, with almost all the projects being focused on something to do with agriculture. And here we had a very broad definition or usage of the term agriculture, which included land rehabilitation, use of mine, acid water drainage, and use of that water for agriculture, biomass, biofuels, and food production. And we'll need to break down that definition going forward. And then there were projects in recycling, like manufacturing, repair, maintenance, and installation, one fintech project, an ecotourism project, and a renewable energy project. Okay, so looking at how well we did with the projects against the framework, when we applied the projects to the first iteration framework, we had an 82% failure rate. And the majority of the failures arose from the pre-screening criteria, and specifically the last two pre-screening criteria. So we had no problem with the excluded activities, and we had no problem with projects complying with South African law and constitution. We had a really big problem when it came to projects who had an engagement strategy with community and labor, and we had a big problem with projects proving that they had internal approval and funding. So I've unpacked these two issues because the thinking behind them is very important in terms of how we fix the problem. So a large majority of projects failed to meet the community and labor voice engagement requirement. The first reason was because a lot of the projects, as I said, weren't place-based. So if you've got a project that isn't place-based, there isn't an identifiable community for you to engage with. So it wasn't that they didn't want to engage, there wasn't an appropriate market for them to engage with. The second reason we saw why people were failing to meet this pre-screening criteria is that the projects were very, very early on in their life cycle. And what a lot of the companies said to us is There are communities we could engage with, but we don't want to create unrealistic expectations on the ground before we know whether the project is technically viable or not. So let us keep quiet, check that we can technically deliver a project, and then we can start our engagements with the community. And the third reason that people weren't engaging with communities is that a lot of the projects were actually structured at what we've called a meso level. They were working with business and government, and given what the project was aiming to achieve, it was irrelevant for them to speak to communities in a given area. Then in terms of unpacking the pre-screening criteria related to funding and approval, the problem wasn't with approval, but how we had defined funding. So all the project developers didn't have funding budgets to show that they had a budget for their just transition project. They'd used sweat equity, and our framework couldn't pick that up, so those projects were excluded. Secondly, a lot of the big companies, the mining houses, the chemical companies, the food companies, had in-house just transition units or in-house sustainability units. Those units didn't have budget to develop projects, but as their normal course of business developed projects, but didn't have project implementation budgets. So our framework kicked those projects out, even though some of them were really terrific projects. And then a lot of the projects were still at a technology phase, and so didn't have funding for the implementation or execution phase, and those projects were also excluded. Moving on, because 82% of the projects were excluded, we decided that looking at the evaluation, we didn't just want to look at the projects who passed because the sample would be too small. So we put the pre-screening aside and we tested all of the projects against the evaluation criteria. And we had a pretty even split. We had 49% of the projects entering through the green entry gate and 51% of them entering through the socio-economic improvement gate. The Green Gate project fared really well. We had a 100% pass rate. Most of those projects were in the mitigation space, 80%, 86% of them. 14% were in sustainable use of water resources. All of them met the threshold for socio-economic improvement project status as well. All of them chose the one outcome, which was to support employment and livelihood opportunities. But then in addition, 28% of them supported new value chains and 14% of them looked at improving community spaces. So the green entry gate appears to have worked really well. We fared less well on the socio-economic improvement entry gate. We only had a 50% pass rate. And the main reason for that were because of two categories of projects. The pilot projects, which we were talking about early in their life cycle. For a socio-economic improvement project, you need to meet two of the objectives in our list. Most of the pilot projects could only meet one, and so they failed the evaluation. Then we had a lot of enabling projects, and I'll talk more about these in a moment. But enabling projects really are looking at policy support and improving the operating environment for the just transition, as opposed to putting boots on the ground and having a tangible investment in terms of a factory or a training program for workers. And we found that the enabling project, we had never designed the framework for enabling project. We had designed the framework for on-the-ground tangible projects. So basically, there were no objectives or activities that were eligible for them. So they all failed because they couldn't meet any of the criteria. So looking at that just transition plus criteria, only 4 of the projects aimed to have some kind of meaningful empowerment, and all of them were successful in achieving their aims of meaningful empowerment. And we measure that in 2 ways. They can either include the community in management representation, or they can provide new asset ownership for a community. And in our case, the 4 projects did both of those, which shows that they were highly ambitious. So all of them were designated as Just Transition Plus projects. Okay, so moving forward, looking at that first iteration, we looked back at the results and we said, there are some really good projects here which we like and we want and we believe are aligned and useful and desirable projects in terms of the just transition. However, our framework is excluding them. So here's the quick list. It excludes enabling projects which look at policy support, capacity building for municipalities, regulatory amendments, supports to government in general. It excludes pilot projects and testing new technologies, which we know is absolutely crucial in developing new green value chains and industries. It excludes entrepreneurial projects where there's sweat equity having gone into the design of the project, but no rands and cents. It excludes projects that are driven by in-house units that haven't got implementation. It excludes place-based projects. It excludes projects which aren't engaging with communities, even though it's inappropriate to engage with a community at that time. So we said, how do we step back and deal with these projects? So we said, the problem is not in the pre-screening criteria and the evaluation criteria themselves. The problem is that we are asking projects to meet criteria that aren't applicable to them. So our framework is too rigid and it can't embrace the heterogeneity of projects that we're seeing on the ground. So what the big box in the middle there says is that projects were being excluded not because they failed to meet a criteria threshold which was applicable to them, but because we're asking them to meet a criteria which isn't applicable to them. So what we said is, let's keep our bars and our standards in place, but let's just be careful about what we ask each project to meet. And so we said, let's keep this fixed menu of criteria, but let's have a discretionary application of those criteria to different types of projects. And that meant that we needed to come up with different types of project categorizations. So in the second iteration, what we have done is, based on the evidence we've collected, we have said there are 8 discrete, mutually exclusive types of projects. And a project champion will decide what is their type of project. So on the left, we've got non-negotiable pre-screening criteria, which is you need to comply with the South African law and you can't be in any of our excluded sectors. We know from the pre-screening that's not problematic. At that point, the champion then needs to decide, am I place-based or am I not place-based? Once they've made that decision, they then get to make a decision about what is the characteristic of their project. Am I an enabling project or am I a tangible project? If they're a tangible project, they then have 3 additional options that they can choose. Is my project at proof of concept stage, project preparation stage, or implementation stage? Now, depending on what choices they make, they end up with an alphanumeric definition of their project. So if you are a place-based, tangible project at a proof of concept, you would be a 1B.1 type of project. That project will attract a specific set of framework criteria, and they will be different to the criteria of all the other 7 types of projects. So you will have a set of criteria that are matched to the characteristics of your project, whether it's place-based or not, and where it is in its life cycle. So that is shown here by the criteria application matrix. So along the side here, we have the 8 different kinds of projects, from a 1A to a 2B3. And along the top, we have a list of different criteria: pre-screening criteria, evaluation criteria. And the X's designate what criteria a given project needs to meet. So a 1A needs to just have formal approval from a champion, needs to have some funding, and needs to meet some of the enabling project objectives and activities, and that is all. Doesn't have to do community participation, doesn't have to go through the entry gate system, doesn't have to look at meaningful empowerment. At the bottom here, we have a 2B3, which is a place-based tangible project ready for implementation. Oh, sorry, that's a 1B. That needs to meet all of the criteria. It has the highest bar of everybody. So when we applied this process to the information that we had, our pass rate went from 18% to 71%. And we had a much better collection of projects that we felt mirrored what we as South Africa want in terms of just transition projects going forward. So we had a much better pool of desirable and aligned projects. We had inclusion of the technology testing and pilot projects, which we thought was so important. And we had now included all the enabling projects. And we must be honest, we are not sure that including enabling projects is the right direction to go. We're putting it in there. We will collect information in the next iteration, and we will see if this is a good way to go or not. We know that we need enabling projects in South Africa because we have a lot of bottlenecks and capacity building challenges in developing a just transition pipeline, be they regulatory challenges, policy challenges, or capacity challenges at the municipal and local level. But we also know that there's a risk that you can create a consulting bubble if you allow enabling projects, and you can allow millions of consultants to come in and write lots of reports and do lots of research and divert money away from on-the-ground projects that are going to help people negatively impacted by the transition, and all the money goes into enabling projects instead. So only time will tell, and we will revisit that when we do the next iteration. Then we obviously know that there's a lot more work to do on parameters, definitions, and fine-tuning the objectives and activities. We know that we need to keep abreast of the ESG and reporting progress. We did a lot more work, and in the documents that are available on our website, you'll see there's a lot of work on indicators, but we haven't dealt with that in this presentation today due to time. I think what we have proven is the value of evidence-based learning in this field, and the fact that we can learn a lot from what is happening on the ground and matching it with what we know theoretically. And the plan is to do the next iteration within the next 2 to 3 years. Thank you very much.
Climate Foundation, and she's going to take us through the role of philanthropy and the value of this work. Over to you, Gita.
Great, thank you very much, Lulumile, and to Sandy for that comprehensive update in terms of where the research is and how the framework is progressing. And good afternoon, everyone. As Lulumile says, my name is Gita Mara. And I'm speaking with you today on behalf of the African Climate Foundation. And I wanted to just thank Sandy and the NBI team for the opportunity to participate on this panel. And also just to say, please excuse my voice and perhaps the occasional cough. I have had the flu this week, but I'm very happy to have been able to join today. So I think I'm going to keep this a little bit brief, because I'm sure following Sandy's presentation, there are a lot of questions and thoughts on the framework. But perhaps just to share some insight into why the ACF sort of chose to support this work and what the value is in it for philanthropies. I think I'm going to start by just giving you a bit of background to the ACF to contextualize. So the ACF is a fairly new organization. It was established in 2020 as the first Africa-led grant maker working in the space or the nexus between climate change and development on the continent. And ACF's core aim in this space is to try and create the kinds of collaborations and networks needed to increase the quantity and quality of support that can contribute to sustained climate action and impact and address development challenges on the continent. And what we've learned through the last few years, and particularly from some of our work in South Africa, is that inequality and the climate crisis are both deeply rooted systemic challenges with multiple causes and effects. And so the projects that need to address these need to be equally complex and robust and necessarily varied in nature in order to address these challenges. And often they also require quite unique blends of finance and blended solutions to support them in their implementation. And so because of this, we see quite a critical role for philanthropy to play in the space, because while philanthropic funding is currently limited in South Africa and on the continent, it can be used in a number of ways to unlock further finance, to catalyze, as catalytic funding to catalyze these projects. It can be used to support with de-risking, as well as to leverage additional capital for these projects. And finally, some of the work can also be used to advocate for and amplify systems change that is needed to achieve the kinds of just and socioeconomic outcomes that we need to see. Philanthropy can also then play a role in supporting initiatives that have just and social outcomes that go beyond simply purely commercial outcomes as well. And so one such model that the ACF has been exploring is called a PPPP model, which is a public-private and philanthropy partnership. And it's a powerful model that has the potential to unlock the diverse role that philanthropies can play in support of implementing these projects. And one of the challenges to the model is of course then understanding which projects can be supported and what their outcomes and their impact can be. And so one of the reasons we supported this work is to produce some guidance to philanthropies and to other stakeholders wanting to provide finance for this kind of work, to understand and define what constitutes a just transition project, to help them make decisions in terms of how this finance can be deployed, and then to also understand the kind of impact that can be achieved through doing so. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you to Sandy for the excellent progress made so far. And we're really looking forward to using the final outcomes to rally further philanthropic support on the continent and in South Africa in support of South Africa's just energy transition and ensuring that our just outcomes are also achieved. Thanks. Thanks, Lulamile. Back to you.
Thank you, Gita. So, yeah, we've reached the end of the presentation part of the program. So up next now is going to be a Q&A session. I understand that there are some online questions, but we'll start here on the room and just ask between you, Sandy, and Gita to address those, yeah. So if there's any questions, please just put up your hand and state your name and your question. Thank you. Okay, there's one there.
Thank you. Hello? Is it on?
Yeah,
Okay,
please go
thanks.
ahead, yeah.
Yeah, it's Mark from the Public Investment Corporation. Thank you for the presentation. I've got 3 questions. If I've missed it, I do apologize. But it's a little bit technical in nature. I wanted to ask, how do you factor in or guard for doing no harm, particularly in the instance of a just transition project? So those projects that would be outside of the green finance taxonomy, because I know there was a reference to the green being to the green finance taxonomy, but the green finance taxonomy doesn't have just transition type projects, and therefore those do no harm principles that you would imply wouldn't apply to, for instance, a coal power station transitioning to gas, for instance. So that's one of the questions in terms of how do you guard for do no significant harm on environmental and social. And then the second question is, how do you justify social relevance? Is it purely through the involvement of communities? So if I give an example, if you do a reskilling program to train coal workers to become artisans that are identified for renewable energy technologies, but those particular artisans or potential artisans are, it's not something that they actually want to do, because it would mean they would have to move to renewable areas, the Northern Cape. So if you have an artisan in Mpumalanga and he doesn't necessarily want to be artisan in the Northern Cape, how does that social relevance get factored in? And then one last question is just on transparency, and I think you touched on it briefly. How does one go about reporting the transparency of something being a just transition project? Thank you very much.
No, thanks for those. Yeah, perhaps we can take these three, then see afterwards if there's any other questions. Yeah, over to you.
Thanks, Lunamile, and thanks, Mark. Those are very good questions. The do no harm is something that there are two things that the framework doesn't do. The first thing is it doesn't test for do no harm, and the second thing is at the moment it is unable to test for the integrity of what you put into your. And both of those are problematic because a harmful project could make its way through, and a project like just transition fronting make its way through. And to be honest, in the framework, we found examples of both of those. Our thinking is that the framework can say, yes, this counts as just transition, but then it needs to go to the financing community, and the financing community need to do their due diligence in terms of deciding whether they will actually grant funding to a project or not. We assumed that that financial sector due diligence process has more experience, better resources, and better capabilities to do that determination than the framework. So the idea very much was that the PIC or the IDC or AFD looking at a project that got a just transition tick from our framework process would then still check for do no harm and for the integrity. And that's what they've done with the BEE framework. And it was a model that we've decided to copy. When or if there is a just transition mechanism in South Africa, and if there is an institutional support, and if there are resources, those are activities that the framework may be able to take on. But at the moment, it's felt that that's asking the framework to do too much. And so we've pushed that onto the funders who would then need to make the final decision. In terms of social relevance, this is an absolutely fundamental question and something that all of us in the community are struggling to answer, because you can tick a box saying, yes, I've reskilled a coal miner. If it's useful and whether he's going to get a job or be prepared to move to where the jobs are is a secondary indicator that needs to be measured. So this comes to being able to measure outcomes and then finally impacts. And I think that this is where it is very difficult to be able to get just transition funding to start moving on the ground while we're still developing the architecture of getting what is the justice impact measured, which is a longer term process. And certainly the people from the IFC, the people from S&P and Fitch and the rating agencies who initially were measuring these things are saying we need to understand that we're flying an aeroplane while we're still building it. And what we've got to do is we've got to say we think it looks like a good enough project now. And as we get better at measuring, we will become better and more granular in terms of excluding projects that don't actually have justice outcomes. But I think we're very much in the early stages. So that's my comment on social relevance. In terms of transparency, some of it comes to the fronting issue that I spoke about before, and the fact that we're going to have to do due diligence. But what this is it's an initial step to say, show me a project plan which tells me what you're going to do, what you're going to achieve, how you're going to measure it, and what outcomes you are planning to have. And on the basis of that, we will give you a designation or not. One of the complexities and nuances which we haven't dealt with in this presentation, but which will be covered in the final documentation, is that a lot of these just transition projects are extremely long in terms of their lifespans. So, for example, you may spend 5 to 10 years rehabilitating land before you are able to start growing a crop on that land and start generating income and resources for a local community. And then a further 5 years before you can actually create empowerment outcomes for that community. So in 20 years' time, it will look like a just transition project. It doesn't look much like a just transition project in the first 5 to 10 years, but you want to support it so that you will have the long-term impact. And how we deal with that temporal issue is highly complex, and that's why we've given the different stages of a project cycle with lower criteria to enable that long time frame. It's a problem that even the global north are having with their just transition criteria, that very often project doesn't look like a just transition project now, but you need it to create long-term just transition outcomes. I hope that answers your questions, Mark.
Okay. Yeah, so as we head towards closing, any other questions or final comments in the room? Yeah. Yeah, so I think with that, then, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of this event. Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.